going to get started. It is 10 o'clock, so it's time for the hour. I want to welcome everybody to our very first ever Pennsylvania Good Government Symposium. We are absolutely thrilled with the turnout. We had over 500 people register for this training today. It was sort of the brainchild of me and Liz Wagenseller, the Office of Open Records Executive Director. We thought, how can we get this information out to people in an easy way or an easily accessible way all over the state? And so we thought we'd give this a try, and we are completely thrilled with the feedback that we've gotten and the interest in this that we have. So before we get started, I just want to mention that this presentation is being recorded. If you're going to continue to attend the presentation, you're consenting to be recorded. So we have to give that legal disclaimer. This presentation, everybody should be muted on the presentation just because there are so many people. But we will have people monitoring the chat throughout my presentation, I think also through the Office of Open Records presentation. So if you have a question as we go through, that's the place to ask it. Type it in. We will do our very best to answer your questions if we can. And I'm going to say this a number of times through the presentation. You can always call us if you have a specific question. If we see some themes, I may address some questions during my presentation verbally, but I don't want to get into too many details about individual situations. We have a lot of material to cover. All right, so this is the Pennsylvania Good Government Symposium. Welcome, everyone. It's jointly hosted by the Ethics Commission and the Office of Open Records. And just a brief agenda, roughly from 10 to 11, I'm going to go over the basics of the Ethics Act. And roughly at 11, from 11 to 12, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Liz Wagenseller, so she can tell you a little bit about what agencies need to know to respond to right-to-know law requests. All right, let's see. So the first thing we're going to cover today is I'm going to talk about the Ethics Act, or what we like to call it, a short guide on how to stay out of the newspapers. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do to start this presentation out is ask you all a question. I would like to know if you trust your government. So if you trust your government to do the right thing all of the time, please raise your hand. All right. We have a few people raising their hand here. All right, so we have some people that trust the government. I imagine many of you are government employees or government officials. So wonderful that you trust yourself. But I also see a lot of no's, a lot of people that say they don't trust their government. All right, raise your hand or give a comment if you never trust your government to do the right thing. And I see people raising their hands again. We always have some people who are critical of government. Fair enough. And we usually get that type of feedback through our presentation. So raise your hand or let me know if you usually trust that your government will do the right thing. Okay, this is where I fall. I usually trust that the government's going to do the right thing. I certainly don't think that they always do, but usually I think that they do.
What the hell?
So we like to ask this question at the beginning of the PowerPoint, just to sort of figure out how people feel about it who are in the room with us or on the Teams call with us. And I want to tell you a few sort of interesting statistics surrounding this question. So have you guys ever heard of the Pew Research Center? Many people have. If you have not heard of this, they call themselves a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. And they have been doing a national election study as part of the work that they do. They've been doing this study since 1958. And since that time, they've been asking people the same question that I just asked you guys. Do you trust your government? And I have some interesting statistics I want to share with you. So in 1958, when they first started asking this question, about 3/4 of Americans that they surveyed said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing almost all the time or most of the time. So 3/4 of Americans in 1958. So my question to you is, do you think since that time there's been an increase or a decrease in trust in government in the United States? All right, I have people saying decrease, and you are absolutely right. Today, the most recent statistics I could find, the results show that less than a quarter of Americans trusted the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. So over just about more than 50 years, we went from three-quarters of Americans to only a quarter of Americans trusting their government. The good news is that trust in government has actually been going up a little bit. The latest statistic was 22% of people trusted their government to do the right thing most of the time. In 2022, it was only 16. So good news is people are having a little bit more trust, but who knows how that's going to change as time goes on. Some other interesting statistics: 65% of adults say that all or most people who seek office at the local, state, or federal level do it in order to serve their own personal interests. And only 21% say that all or most people who run for office do it in order to serve their communities. So these questions were pretty much about federal government, but there's really no reason to believe that people's feelings are any different when we talk about state or local government. So that's why we're here. I want to say before I move on to the next slide, I'm really thrilled because when I looked at the attendance list, the people who had signed up to attend this presentation, based upon the email addresses of the people who had signed up, we have people here from the state level, from local government level. We have people from all over the state here, from Erie, Warren, Forest County, all the way down to the Philadelphia area. So I'm really excited to see local government represented so much. And we also have so many people from state government as well. So really, really excited. But think about this. This is how people feel about us as government employees and officials. All right, so this leads into what our core mission is. The Pennsylvania State Ethics Commission's core mission and guiding principle is that public office is a public trust, and any effort to realize personal financial gain other than compensation provided for by law. We are allowed to be paid for the work that we do if our statutes allow that. But any effort to realize personal financial gain through one's public office is a violation of that trust. And I want to point out just a couple terms in here. The first one is public trust. So everything that we do should be in support of the public trust. And the other term I want to point out is the term personal financial gain, because in order for us to get involved as a State Ethics Commission, somebody has to have received some sort of a personal financial gain. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. And on another slide, in a little more detail. Another thing, if you are on this call and you don't have your sound muted, if you could mute yourself. I am getting a little bit of feedback. All right. So you may be asking yourself, well, what's your jurisdiction? Who do you have authority over? And really, there's two big buckets of people in Pennsylvania that the Ethics Commission has jurisdiction over. The first bucket are our public officials. And public officials are going to be anybody that's elected by the public or elected or appointed by a governmental body or an appointed official in the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the Commonwealth or any political subdivision thereof. This is anybody that's elected to a public position. This includes people like our senators and our state representatives, our governor, our county commissioners, our borough council members, township supervisors, township commissioners, all school board members. All of those folks are considered public officials. Also considered public officials are going to be people appointed, like our cabinet secretaries at the state level. Authority board members are public officials. So that's our one bucket. We think that bucket is probably smaller than the other bucket. The other bucket are public employees. And these folks are people who are employed by the Commonwealth or a political subdivision who are responsible for taking or recommending official action of a non-ministerial nature with regard to one of these 5 bullets. And I don't need to read this for you. You guys can read it yourselves. But the way I like to think about this is these are the people who are employed by a governmental body within the state who can have some sort of a financial impact or make decisions about how money is being spent. And so if you, in your position, are employed by a governmental entity and you can do one of these things or multiple of these things, you're probably going to be considered a public employee under the Ethics Act. So we think that there's probably around 160,000 people in Pennsylvania subject to one of these two definitions. It's a lot of people that are subject to our jurisdiction. If you ever have questions about whether you or somebody within your governmental body falls within one of these two definitions, you can give us a call and we'll talk through it with you. You can also reference our regulations. They have a lot more detail about who might be covered as either a public official or a public employee. But if you fall within one of these definitions, you are subject to the provisions of the Ethics Act that I'm going to talk about through this presentation. There's a few other sort of nuances here. We also have solicitors are subject to some of the provisions of the Ethics Act. They are subject to our statement of financial interest filing requirements that I'm going to talk about at the end of my presentation. And then there's a couple of provisions that any person is subject to, and I'm going to tell you about that when we get to those provisions, but anybody in the whole wide world can be subject to our jurisdiction if they violate one of those provisions. So we'll talk about that later, but for the most part, we're talking about public officials and public employees. All right, so we have three primary functions at the Ethics Commission. The first is we do investigations, and I'm going to tell you about some of our investigations and some of our cases and some stories about what you should not do. We also issue advices and opinions. And when I get to that section of the presentation, please pay attention because this is an amazing tool that's available to public officials and public employees, and it can be really, really helpful. And then we have the statements of financial interests, filing requirements that we monitor across the state, and we'll talk about that a bit too. So the Ethics Act in Section 1103 has a bunch of restricted activities. I think there's 10 of them. And those are the things that you as a public official or public employee are not allowed to do. I'm going to talk about just a few of them because we see the same ones over and over violated the most. So I'm really just going to touch on some of the more frequently violated ones, but want you to know there are others. So we'll go through these, and you can always reach out if you have questions. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is conflict of interest. Most of our cases that come before us involve an allegation that somebody has violated the conflict of interest provision of the Ethics Act. And I'm going to talk about what a conflict of interest is, but I want to first talk about what a conflict of interest under the Ethics Act is not. So we get about 250 to 400 complaints in every year. And those complaints really run the gamut of things. When we talk about conflict of interest, there has to be an allegation that a public official or public employee received some sort of a financial gain. That means that we can't look at things like I get a lot of complaints about bad prison food or, prison related issues. We get complaints about neighbors who are fighting over property rights and things like that. We get complaints even about marital infidelity. While those things may not be ethical, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have jurisdiction over them and that we're able to look at them. So we have to have an allegation that somebody has violated one of these restricted activities provisions specifically in our law before we can get involved. All right, so conflict of interest, like I said, is the most frequently violated section of our law. If you look at the Ethics Act itself, and I think one of my colleagues dropped a link in the chat at the very beginning of the chat to our Red Book, which contains the Ethics Act. You can pull that up and take a look at it. But conflict of interest is in Section 1103A. And if you open it up and you read 1103A, what you'll read is that no public official or public employee shall engage in conduct that constitutes a conflict of interest. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. So what does that mean? In order to really understand it, then you have to go to the definitions, which are in 1102. So if you look at the definition of conflict of interest, this is what it will say. Conflict of interest is use of authority of office That's anything that you can do by virtue of serving as a public official or public employee. If everybody in the world can do it, it's not going to be authority of your office. So use of authority of office or confidential information that you get because you're serving in that position. Prong two, for the private pecuniary benefit. Here's where we're talking about money. You have to either receive some money or avoid some sort of a financial loss or penalty. And that benefit has to be for yourself, a member of your immediate family, or a business with which you or a member of your immediate family are associated. And like all laws, each of these terms are independently defined within the Ethics Act itself. For example, immediate family member is only going to be your parent, your spouse, your child, your brother, or your sister. So if we got a complaint in that someone had violated the conflict of interest provision by awarding a contract maybe to their niece's business, not going to be something that we can look at because it doesn't meet the statutory definitions and the statutory requirements. So there's only 3 prongs to this provision. It seems very simple on its face. In practice, it can be a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more complicated. So talk about that a little bit more. But before I do, I want to tell you that there are a couple of exceptions to the conflict of interest provision. The first one is if the action you take has a de minimis economic impact. This isn't defined in the law. We wish sometimes it was. It has not been defined in the law. There has been cases that have said around $600 can be de minimis, but we don't have a hard number. So I would never rely on, well, I'm only going to receive $599, so I'm going to be fine. Don't do that. If you start receiving a benefit, if you're using your position and you're receiving a benefit and it's in the hundreds of dollar ranges, I'd be very, very wary about relying on this particular exception to the definition of conflict of interest. But I think this was written in there because, we do investigations, and if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, or it's just not very much money involved, not going to be a conflict of interest that we're going to do an investigation on. The other exceptions are related. One says if the action affects to the same degree a class consisting of the general public or a subclass consisting of an industry, occupation, or other group. So what this can look like is, say you're a borough council member and you have to vote on a union contract and your child is a member of that union and all the union members are receiving the same raise. Probably that's going to be a subject to this subclass exception, and you're going to be allowed to vote on it. Yeah, you're going to be able to vote on it. So it would fall within that exception. All right. And I saw people that aren't muted. So if you're able to mute, that would be great. All right. So what do these look like in real life? And I'm going to tell you about some sort of themes that we see with our cases. The first one, we see a lot of cases involving nepotism, situations where a public official may act to have their child or their spouse hired for an open position at their governmental entity. Or maybe they work behind the scenes in order to get insurance benefits for a spouse or a child that works there that they wouldn't otherwise be eligible to receive. So these cases can take a lot of different forms. We had a case that was, it was a case that started here at the commission. It actually has a complicated appellate history and ended up going to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. What happened was that we had a township supervisor, and the township had a nepotism policy that prohibited immediate family members from working together at the same township, at the township. And the township supervisor had a son who needed a job. Now, he knew that he wasn't allowed to vote to get rid of the nepotism policy so that his son could get hired. So instead, he would go behind the scenes and sort of bug and pick at his fellow township supervisors and say, get rid of the nepotism policy, get rid of the nepotism policy, get rid of it. And he lobbied them behind the scenes. So this matter comes up for vote at the public meeting, and on the agenda is, are we going to get rid of this nepotism policy? And the township supervisors go around to vote, and they all vote, we're getting rid of the nepotism policy. I vote to get rid of the nepotism policy. Our township supervisor says, I can't vote on it. If we get rid of it, my son will be able to get hired, so I'm going to abstain. The motion passed, the nepotism policy was removed, the son was hired, and it was reported to us on a complaint. We conducted an investigation and the commission found that even though he didn't vote at the public meeting, he used his office to go behind the scenes and lobby his fellow supervisors to remove the policy. And as a result, his son was hired and he was paid. He argued that, it wasn't a violation of the Ethics Act. He had done nothing wrong. This case ended up getting appealed to the Supreme Court. Loved the decision because the Supreme Court said that a conflict of interest or use of office can be more than just voting at a public meeting. It can be doing things like lobbying your fellow supervisors behind the scenes for the result that you want. Because of his position, he had that access. He used his office and there was a conflict of interest as a result. So that's just one example of how these cases can pan out, but nepotism is an issue. All right, so I'm going to show a series of videos over the next few slides. These videos show violations of the Ethics Act in practice. I want to tell you that all of these videos are based loosely on real cases that we have handled here at the State Ethics Commission. I did have a sister state agency make these for us, which is amazing, but we didn't use the same characters. We didn't change the characters up. So after you're finished watching one of the videos, wipe your brain clean. The characters are new in each one. But I'm going to show you next a video that shows what nepotism might look like in real life.
Hey Chief, how have things been going?
Good, just trying to keep our heads above water. How about you?
I'm doing good too. It's been an interesting first year as borough mayor, learning the ropes. I didn't realize that even the chief of police reports to me. Convenient for getting out of those speeding tickets. Hey, do you remember my son Bill? All-star quarterback, he took the high school team to states twice. He's a bit of a legend around these parts. Basically put this little town on the map.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Isn't he an officer in the city?
Well, he was an officer in the city. Got in a little hot water after some evidence and cash were apparently missing from a few of his cases, and the brass didn't take kindly to it. Bunch of politically correct nonsense in my opinion. Anyway, he's moving back here with his wife and kids, which brings me to why I stopped by. Bill's looking for work, and I know you're looking to hire. He's a great officer. Think you could offer him a job?
We do have a couple vacant spots, but applications were due last week, and we got a lot of good candidates.
Come on, Chief. Surely you can make an exception for an old friend and the town hero.
Sir, you know how we do things by the book here.
And Chief, you know your own contract is up for renewal, and I have the final say on whether you continue as chief. I hope we understand each other.
I understand you perfectly.
All right, does anybody see any conflicts of interest here or any uses of office? You can type it in the chat if you see any. All right, it's all over. Blackmail, a major conflict of interest and abuse of office. All right, yeah, you guys are spot on. A couple of things. The first would, there was kind of a half joke, half serious, convenient for getting out of the speeding tickets, right? But the real issue here is the pressure applied in order to get his son hired. Yeah, and the sort of threat that if you don't do what I want, your own contract is going to be up or is going to be at risk. All right, good job, guys. Everybody's kind of getting it. All right, let's move along. Another sort of real big bucket of cases that we see are use of government assets. We kind of joke around here a little bit that our bread and butter cases are cases where there's a township, say a township supervisor, a borough council member who directs the road crew to pave their driveway, and they use the road millings. We see a lot of those cases. If you think you might want to do that, please don't do that. But they're more than just paving driveways. We've seen cases where people, they work for the state and they are running an entire real estate business from their desk while they're supposed to be working for the state. Things like it can be use of IT equipment. It can be even use of your staff. For example, if you have staff members that report to you and you're having them do work for a private business while getting paid by the taxpayers, that can be a real problem. Or if they're doing political activity for you, if say you're running for office and your subordinate staff is doing campaign related work for you while they're getting paid by the taxpayers, that can be a real problem. Please, please do not do that. One recent case we had that it had a really huge payback. It involved us a surveyor. He was a PennDOT employee. He worked for the survey unit, and he had access as part of his job with PennDOT to this really new and good survey equipment. It was actually physical equipment, but also IT programs. And in his private capacity, he also ran a private survey business. Now, to his credit, he actually requested approval to have that supplementary employment as his private business. But what he didn't say is he wanted to also use the PennDOT IT equipment and survey equipment for his private business, which he did. And he ended up making a boatload of money in his private business using that PennDOT IT and survey equipment. This came to us as a complaint, and we conducted an investigation, found that he had violated the Ethics Act. He ended up settling the case with us, and he had to pay back $62,000 to the Commonwealth. So it was a pretty significant case. Other situations where we see use of government assets can be using maybe your governmental body's equipment. And I'm going to show you the next video so you could see what that looks like in real life. And this next video, like I said, was also loosely based on a case that we investigated.
Hey, Chuck. I was just stopping by to see how things are going with the township paving project. The other township supervisors and I were just talking about how great the roads look.
Thanks, boss. About another week or so and it should be done.
That's great. Ahead of schedule and under budget, just how we like it. So I was wondering, is there any chance there's any leftover paving materials? You know, what you would just throw away?
I think we overestimated a bit when we ordered it.
Listen, Chuck, you did such a great job with the road in front of my house. It's making my driveway look terrible. Any chance the crew could come by quick and fix up my driveway too? You know, with the leftover material.
Sure. We could do it after hours some evening.
No, I don't want to get into paying overtime and all that. Just call it an early day some afternoon and swing by on your way back to the township garage. No need to make a special trip. Chuck, I really appreciate you taking care of my driveway. The wifey loves it, and you really earned me some points.
Oh, you're welcome, boss.
I have a huge favor to ask you, Chuck. You know I have all those trees in my backyard? Well, a few fell during the storm last week, and I need to clear them out. The problem is I hurt my back a few years ago, and you know I'm not as young as I once was. A backhoe would sure make things easier on me.
Well, I think the hardware store has backhoes for rent.
That would cost me a fortune, Chuck, and we have one here that's just sitting in the garage. Any chance I could just borrow it for this quick job?
Boss, it's not easy to use, and you know it's for township use only.
No problem, Chuck. I worked construction in high school. I know what I'm doing. I'll use it this weekend and bring it back before Monday morning. No one will even know it's gone. Just leave me the garage key. Hey, Chuck. Sorry to call you on a Sunday, but I had a bit of an accident with the backhoe. I was heading back to take care of those trees and forgot to lower the arm. I knocked down a power line. Yeah, that's probably why the power's out in town. There's a good amount of damage here, and I need to call the power company. But, Chuck, just so we have our story straight, I was doing work for the township when this happened, right? That way the township's insurance should cover it. I can't afford to pay for this mess out of pocket. And, Chuck, no one needs to know what really happened.
All right, does anyone see issues with this? Any uses of office? All right, I see some hands raised. Benny, yes. This guy's a dirtbag. Yes, yes, he's a dirtbag. All right. Yeah, this is, like I said, this is based on a true case that we had handled. I just want to sort of mention to you, if everybody can't do it, then you as a township supervisor, borough council member, public official, public employee also can't do it. You shouldn't be getting those special favors by virtue of your office. And this is really, I mean, this is really what we're about here. Yeah, I see a lot. I see a lot of comments. All right. If you don't see an issue, I hope you are not in office. Jim, I agree with you. All right. Do people lose their job? I'm going to talk about what penalties. Somebody asks, do these people lose their job? I'm going to talk about the penalties later in the presentation. Sometimes they do, but not because of the State Ethics Commission, not because of our authority. So I'll get there as we keep going through the PowerPoint. All right. So the next thing we see a lot of issues around involves gifts, travel, lodging, and hospitality. So I'm going to say that the Ethics Act does not prohibit the acceptance of true, no strings attached gifts. And I want to say that like in bold and underlined, true, no strings attached gifts. The problem is that the larger the gifts are and the more expensive the travel, lodging, and hospitality is that's received by a public official or public employee, the more it can create the inference of a conflict of interest, and it can become a problem very, very quickly. Also, if you are receiving gifts, travel, lodging, and hospitality, you might have to disclose them on your statement of financial interest, and I'm going to talk about towards the end of the presentation. But we see a lot of issues around these things. So we see them when vendors are giving them to a public official, public employee. We also see them when people are traveling for work. So, for example, we have many cases where public officials, public employees go to conferences or trainings or things like that, and they use it as a personal vacation. They take along family members, and then they get reimbursed for their expense, the family members' expenses. Or, they go to these conferences and never even show up at the conference. Instead, they just do sightseeing in a personal vacation. Or they try to charge back, or they successfully charge back to their governmental entities non-business or non-work related items, massages, for example, tours, things like that. So that can become a problem as well. So keep that in mind as you go about your day-to-day work. If you're provided the opportunity to travel for your public office or public employment, just be very careful about it. But I want to tell you a story about the receipt of travel, lodging, and hospitality. And this is my favorite ever State Ethics Commission case. I wonder, does anybody know what this is? Does anybody recognize this? Okay, I see some people raising their hands. Kinzua Bridge. Yeah. So, yeah, the Railroad Bridge. Yes, Kinzua. So I have lots of people. I think I probably have some people. I know I have some people from Warren County, some people from Elk County, Forest County. This is actually in McKean County. I grew up really close to this bridge. And when we were kids, we used to go on picnics. We would go up to the bridge. We'd hike across the bridge and just do it like on a nice summer day. And I just remember it being really, really scary because it's way higher than it looks in this picture. So this bridge, just some background on the bridge. I think it was built like in the 1880s. It was a railroad bridge. And it started, it was very old. It was sort of as a point of pride for people that live up in the area. I think at one point it maybe was considered one of the 8 engineering wonders of the world, but it's very cool. But it started to deteriorate, and it had gone through various levels of repair over the years, but it was starting to deteriorate. They had shut it down to train traffic. It was just available for people to walk across, but it was still not structurally sound. And so it was the responsibility of a state agency, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DCNR. It was their responsibility to make sure that this bridge was structurally sound. And in particular, there was one guy that worked for DCED, and he was a public employee based upon the duties of his job. And it was his responsibility to get this bridge structure, make it structurally sound. And so they hired an engineer, they did an analysis about what they needed to do. It became an emergency very quickly. And since it was an emergency, they were able to sort of avoid some of the competitive procurement rules and do direct purchases of things that they needed to make this bridge more structurally sound. And one of those things that the engineers recommended was to apply an epoxy coating to some of the rusted areas on the bridge. And that was just one piece of a whole lot of other stuff that they were doing for this bridge, but it was one piece of this project. And so our DCNR guy goes directly to a company to purchase the epoxy, and the company manufactured it at their factory over in England. So he did this direct purchase, and there was warranties that were supposed to be provided along with this epoxy. So they buy it, they ship it out to the job site. The workers are there and they're applying this epoxy to the rusted areas on this bridge where it's supposed to help, and it wasn't adhering correctly. And it could have been maybe the humidity or the temperature, I don't know why. But these workers kept on going to our DCNR employee and saying, hey, this isn't going on right. This isn't working right. And he's ignoring it and poo-pooing him. And he's not pushing back against the epoxy company when they're not making good on the warranties. He's just letting it go. Well, we come to find out that the reason he was letting it go was because at that time that they were having the adherence problems, he had accepted an all expenses paid trip for him and his wife to go to England, ostensibly to tour the epoxy factory. But of course, they didn't tour the factory. They instead went on sightseeing events. They saw England, had a great time on this personal vacation. And while he was over in England, ignoring the problems that were going on with the bridge and having this personal vacation that was funded by the epoxy company, a tornado came down through the valley and it knocked down the bridge. And honestly, the epoxy wasn't going to hold the bridge up, but it certainly didn't help. And this is what the bridge looks like today. The tornado knocked down a good portion of the bridge. And you can go up there today and you can walk out. Actually, I don't think you can. I think it might be closed for repairs right now. But at some point when it's open, you can walk out on what remains of the Kinzua Bridge and look down into the valley. It has a glass floor at the end on where the viewing area is. It is much higher in real life than it looks in this picture, but it's very, very cool. But this case came up, it was referred to us, we conducted an investigation, and we found that he failed to exercise his job obligations and the obligations of his position because he had accepted that vacation from the epoxy company. So he used his office by failing to do what he had to do, and he received that private pecuniary gain. The commission found that he had violated the conflict of interest provision of the Ethics Act, and he had to pay back, I think it was around $4,000, which at the time was about the value of the trip. So I love this case because it shows how it's a great story, but it really shows how someone's influence or someone's judgment can be influenced by the receipt of something of value. So, okay, bridge is supposed to reopen this fall, but yes, it's a cool story. So if you go up and you're walking out at the end of the bridge, make sure you think about how important government ethics are. All right, another video. Now here's an example of how a gift can go from something small to something very big, and someone can act in reliance on it. So, like I said, wipe your brain clean from these characters, pretend these are totally new characters. So here we go.
Hey, look what just arrived.
Ooh, how nice. Who's it from?
A vendor from the food service contract at school. The note says, "Dear Mr. O'Donnell, we hope you enjoy this sample of our delicious and nutritious food that our company hopes to provide the students of Suburban School District. Best wishes, Bobby Hamilton, CEO, Hamilton Food Service."
Well, that is so very nice of him.
You know, I'm going to give him a call to thank him. I just got off the phone with Bobby. What a great guy. He's so down to earth, seems like the kind of guy you could grab a beer with. Did you know he's a huge Eagles fan?
Wow, you must have a lot in common then.
I know. He invited me down for a tour of his plant to get a better sense of what they can offer. And get this, how would you like to see the Eagles play this Sunday? He has 2 extra tickets.
That's awesome. I've been hoping to see them play all year, and I would love to go. It seems like that Bobby might be a good friend to have. Bobby, thank you so much for inviting us to the game. When Tom said Eagles tickets, I had no idea we'd be watching the game in style from these box seats. And all the food and drinks were wonderful. The only thing that could have made this better is an Eagles win.
It was definitely a disappointing loss, but I'm so glad you could come. It was great to meet you, and I hope we can make these games a regular thing. Hey, Tom, before you go, I understand the vote on the food service contract is Tuesday. Any idea where things stand?
Well, you know, there's a lot of competition, but I'd say things are looking pretty good for you.
That's great. I knew I could count on your support. Also, we want to give you a little something for your favorite charity.
Well, isn't that nice of you? Thank you.
I'll take that. I know exactly which charity this is going to. Our Children's College Fund.
Does anyone see any problems? Besides the fact that this obviously was made before last football season. Yes, buying the vote. Okay. Yeah. Buying the vote. So many problems being bought out for sure. What do you guys think about accepting the fruit basket? We get a lot of questions about this. Gifts were piling up. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, a fruit basket, is somebody going to take action, official action based on receipt of a fruit basket? Probably not. But the more things cost and the bigger value they are, it creates this inference that any action he takes to benefit this food service company is going to look like it's a conflict of interest. And, you know, is it probably, if, you know, if you're getting plied with all of these things, they're doing it in order to, you know, get you to vote, or take action to benefit you in a favorable way. All right. Yep. We have some suggestions here. Anyone that sends a gift basket, we put it in the lunchroom for everyone to enjoy. Like that's, you know, that's a good practice, because then it's not private pecuniary gain. It's something that's shared amongst your office. But like I said, true no strings attached gifts are okay. It's just, it gets real quickly. It can go sideways. One other thing I want to mention, especially with regard to gifts, the Ethics Act is always going to be the floor for your ethical behavior. Governmental bodies regularly do create their own policies that can impose more stringent obligations on those who are subject to them. For example, many of you probably have heard Governor Wolf had a gift ban. For our former governor had a gift ban where we weren't even allowed to accept a bottle of water. Now that's been changed under Governor Shapiro, but they are both fine under the Ethics Act in creating these more strict policies that guide the behavior of those who they have jurisdiction over. Governmental entities can and do impose their own more stringent ethics codes, but the Ethics Act itself will always be the floor. Okay. And there's a lot of good ideas in the chat. So, you know, if you want to kind of see how others handle those situations, you can see that there. All right. So what are you supposed to do if you have a conflict of interest? And this, I just don't understand why people can't figure this out. It is so simple. If you have a conflict as to a particular matter, just abstain. Just don't have anything to do with it. In my example about the township supervisor who lobbied his other township supervisors to remove the nepotism policy behind the scenes, that was bad because he didn't fully abstain. Fully abstain, have nothing to do with the situation, and you're going to be fine. I do want to mention there is one additional provision that applies when you would have to be voting on a matter in which you have a conflict, and this is an 1103J of our law, and a lot of people don't know about it. What it says essentially is if you're required to vote, if it's a situation where you would be required to vote, you still have to abstain, but you should also publicly announce and disclose the nature of your interest in a written memo with the person who's recording the meeting minutes. This serves a number of purposes. Number one, you meet the legal requirements of the Ethics Act. But number two, I can't tell you how often we have investigations where the meeting minutes are messed up or messy or unclear. If you have a written memo on file that says I abstained with regard to this particular vote, that's going to clear up any discrepancies or confusion in the meeting minutes. So it protects you. It also ensures that you're compliant with the law. People ask, is there any particular form that needs to be done? No, there's no particular form. We have a template here that you can use, and we're happy to share that you can fill it in, but that's not certainly required. Just put it on record, you know, I have a conflict of interest. I'm putting it on the record verbally. I'm putting in this memo and I'm abstaining, and you're going to be covered in it. It really will help you a lot, especially if it's a dicey issue. All right. So I told you at the very beginning that there was a provision in the Ethics Act that applies to persons, and these are our improper influence sections. They're 1103A, or I'm sorry, 1103B and 1103C. Basically, they are a situation where if you do this for me, I'm going to do this for you. If you scratch my back, I'm going to scratch your back. And this can be between two people who are both subject to the Ethics Act, or it can be between anybody in the world and a public official or public employee. So we had a couple of cases out in the Pittsburgh area recently, or within the last few years, involving improper influence. On the one hand, we had a school superintendent in a school district. He had a kid that needed a job. And on the other hand, we had a school board member in another district who also had a kid that needed a job. And so what they did is they got together and they said, if you hire my child, then I will hire your child. And in at least one of the instances, in doing so, they sort of circumvented the ordinary hiring process and allowed the one child to jump ahead of others in the process. So it was, unfairly hired. Both of the kids were hired for those jobs. By all accounts, they both did a good job when they were hired. They both were very good teachers. But this came to our attention. Someone had disclosed it to us. We conducted an investigation and discovered that they did engage in, if you do this for me, I'm going to do this for you, and that they both violated the 1103 B and C improper influence provisions in doing so. They didn't have to pay any money back. They because of the way some case law has recently come out, if the benefit is going to the child, there's no payment back to the governmental entity. However, this got a ton of press out in the Pittsburgh area. It was all over the news. People were very upset. I think both of them lost their positions, but I think that the worst thing was, as a parent myself, I feel that it would be the negative attention for my child as a result of what had happened here. So don't do this. And if you have questions about us, give us a call. All right, one more provision of the Ethics Act I want to tell you about. And I particularly want to bring this up because we've seen lately a bit of a trend with regard to people not knowing about this particular requirement or misunderstanding this particular requirement. So this is our 1103G provision. We call this the revolving door provision, and here's the elements. First, no former, so this is only once you leave, no former public official or public employee shall represent a person, and a person is it can be another business, but it can also be yourself, for promised or actual compensation before their former governmental body for 1 year after leaving. So you can't come back after leaving within that year and represent a company, maybe a private company who has hired you. You can't take advantage of those personal connections that you had because of your former employment within that 1 year time frame. You have to stay away. You can work behind the scenes, but you can't be listed on materials that are going to your former governmental body. You also cannot, under 1103G and the way the commission has interpreted it, be hired right back as a consultant performing the same work before your former governmental body. That can be a problem, and that can be a violation of the 1103G revolving door provision. All right. So that's all I wanted to tell you about the things you're not allowed to do. And I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about what you can do and how we can help you. So the Ethics Act contains a provision that allows a public official or a public employee to write into us, tell us all the facts of a particular situation, and ask for advice or an opinion of the commission. And we'll provide that to you, and it'll tell you what you can and can't do. And provided that you've given us all the relevant facts and you've been honest and you've followed it, you cannot be prosecuted by us for a violation of the Ethics Act. So they're really great because it gives you that legal clearance. The other really good thing about them is if you have a particularly dicey issue out in your governmental body and you know somebody's going to be questioning you about it, and you write in and you get an advice from us, you have a defense. You have it in your hand, and you can say, you know what, I asked, and I'm doing what they told me to do, and that would be very helpful. So I want you to know about this opportunity. So like I said, the commission provides this advice and guidance regarding the duties of those who are subject to the Ethics Act. It's in the form of advices of counsel and opinions of the commission. They take about a month. So if you're going to request one, you need to make sure you plan ahead. You can also ask that they be confidential. And if you ask that, you'll get actually two of them. You'll get one that's redacted and one that's unredacted. And only the redacted version will be posted onto our website. So you can maintain your confidentiality. Another thing about these, you can't ask for them on behalf of somebody else generally. You can't say, I think that my another of the borough council members is going to do something wrong. Ethics Commission, what do you think? You can only really do it for yourself. There's some really limited exceptions, but for the most part, you can only ask for it for your own behavior. Another really big caveat is if you say you vote to hire a company that employs your spouse, you get them on as a consultant, you're paying them, and somebody raises an issue, you can't then write into us and say, hey, I did this. Was it okay? Because you're not asking for advice. You're actually confessing something that you did wrong, and we're looking at a whole nother process under the Ethics Act. So plan ahead, look ahead, but know that this opportunity exists. So now I want to talk about the process for investigations. I told you what some of our investigations look like, but this is the process. Like I said, we get about 250 to 400 complaints in a year. We open roughly about 10% of those. It depends, but we only open the ones that allege a violation of the Ethics Act. And we're able to open them into an investigation. We do about a 60-day vetting process where we determine if there is actually merit to the complaint. And if we find that there is, we can open it into a full investigation. We can issue subpoenas, take sworn statements, we gather documents. We are very meticulous with our investigations. We want to make sure that if we're charging somebody with a violation of the Ethics Act, that we're getting it right. All of the proceedings and records relating to an investigation are confidential. No one can get them. We will not turn them over. We take keeping the identity of our complainants confidential very seriously. We do not disclose who filed complaints against other people. The only thing that becomes public is the final order of the commission. Our cases, they can resolve one of two ways. We can either have a hearing on a case, we do many trials on them, and then they result in a final order of the commission, or a lot of our cases, we enter into settlement agreements, also end up as a final order of the commission, but those are the only things that are publicly accessible under the Ethics Act. Sometimes people will self-disclose that they filed a complaint, and there has been case law that said that's okay. They're allowed to self-disclose. They have the First Amendment right to do so, but we will never, ever disclose who filed a complaint. So what kind of penalties are there? And there was a question I know earlier in the chat about penalties. So we are an administrative agency, which means we cannot charge people with crimes here. What we can do is charge people administratively with a violation of the Ethics Act. We can issue a public order. The commission can issue restitution, and in more egregious cases can also impose treble penalties against people who violated the Ethics Act. I think honestly, from just my experience, the biggest penalty is the publicity of it. The public order is usually worse, and it can be more damaging. We cannot fire people from their jobs. We cannot kick people out of public office. They need to be impeached and follow the constitutional procedure for that. The State Ethics Commission cannot do that. These are the penalties that are available to us: the public order, restitution, and treble penalties, unless we negotiate something else, which we can do, but this is what the commission itself can order. However, the Ethics Act can be charged criminally by criminal justice agencies like the DA's office, the Attorney General's office, the feds. Depending on the provision charged, it can be a misdemeanor or a felony with up to $10,000 fine and up to 5 years in prison. So there are some serious penalties if you're criminally charged under the Ethics Act. And then the statements of financial interest that I'm going to kind of close out this presentation about. If you don't file your form, or you file a deficient form and you won't correct, or you don't correct it, or the commission can fine you up to $250 per form. So, and we have a 5-year look back period. So those penalties can be pretty steep. So I'm going to talk about statements of financial interest. So May 1st is coming up. That's the filing deadline. All public officials, public employees, solicitors, candidates, and nominees, as those terms are all defined in the Ethics Act, must file statements of financial interest. I recently heard someone say to me, I only have to file a statement of financial interest when the first year I come into the position. That is incorrect. It's legally incorrect. You have to have a statement of financial interest on file for every year in which you serve in a particular capacity. For example, if you are a public official for one day in 2024, if you were there for one day, then you have to make sure that there's a 2024 calendar year statement of financial interest on file. So please do this. Just get these done. We estimate 160,000 people are subject to our law. That means 160,000 people should be filing these forms every year. We get a lot of grumbling about them. I file them. My staff files them. They're not that onerous. Just get them done. The idea behind them is so that the public can see where the personal interests of the people who are representing them may lie. And they're not that onerous. So please just get them done. This is just a tremendous amount of transparency for the taxpayers and citizens of Pennsylvania. All right, so like I said, they must be filed by May 1st, reporting financial information for the prior calendar year. So really think about these like tax returns. You're disclosing the information, the financial information for 2024, but you have to file it by May 1st of 2025. If you serve in multiple capacities. So for example, a lot of solicitors may have numerous municipal clients. They need to make sure that they have one statement of financial interest completed with all of their municipal clients and all of their information on that one form, and they need to copy it and file it at every location that's one of their filing locations. So don't do too much work and create separate forms for each place. Do one, add attachments if you need to, and file a single form everywhere that you need to file it. Let's see. If you're sitting here thinking, oh crap, I was supposed to do this and I didn't do it for earlier calendar years, just go and get it done. Late is better than not filed. Please don't backdate it to make it appear as though it had been timely filed. Just be honest and transparent about it. We're really, really looking for compliance generally with these cases. All right. Statements of financial interests are public records. And I want to mention this as we kind of roll into the right to know law piece of this. Statements of financial interests are public records. I have seen another recent theme of complaints where citizens are requesting these. They go to the local governmental entity. They're told to file a right to know request. So they wait 5 business days and then they take the extension, and 37 days later, they might be receiving redacted statements of financial interest. Don't do that. You're creating way more work than needs to be created. The Ethics Act, which trumps all other conflicting state laws, says that statements of financial interest shall be made available for public inspection and copying during regular office hours. If they're more than 2 years old, you have 2 days to provide them. So if they're not the current calendar year, you have 2 days to provide them. Keep them on file for 5 years. Older ones you can destroy. Please don't make people jump through hoops to get these records. They're public records. Also, nothing that's on them that's required to be disclosed should be redacted. So anything that's listed specifically as a question, you shouldn't be redacting them. They're public records. There's case law that says that this information should not be redacted. One tip, when you're putting your address on there, you are permitted to put on your business address as opposed to your home address. And that's what I do on my form. So Just a few tips to kind of avoid issues. All right, so I'm going to end this presentation with a story about statements of financial interest. I want to tell you, this is a case that I handled when I worked previously at the Ethics Commission many years ago. It came to our attention, it comes to our attention many different ways if someone has filed a deficient or delinquent statement of financial interest. Sometimes we do compliance reviews, sometimes we get complaints. There's all different ways we find out that maybe statements of financial interest aren't done correctly. So in this particular instance, this was involving somebody who was a former employee of the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. She had actually left, so she was a former. So I think she left, I can't read this, I think she left in 2008 and she hadn't filed the form. She worked there in 2008, but hadn't filed the form by May 1st, 2009. So we reached out to her and we said, hey, you're subject to these filing requirements, but you didn't file your form. If you have 20 days to fix this. If you fix it, nothing will happen. So we sent her this letter and she ignored the letter. And so we sent a second letter to her, and it's a little bit meaner, and it says like final notice in bold or caps or something. And it says, it's come to our attention, you haven't filed this form. If you do it within 20 days, nothing bad will happen to you. Well, she ignored the second letter. And so we have a process in our law called our petition for civil penalty process, where we ask the commission to impose a penalty. And the commission did. They found that she hadn't done what she was supposed to do. She got the required notices and she filed a penalty. They imposed a penalty. She ignored the commission's order. And so we can't have that happen. So we went to Commonwealth Court and said she didn't follow the commission's order. And they issued an order, said, you have to do what the commission says you were supposed to do. And here's $371 in court costs. Well, she still ignored the Commonwealth Court. And so we went back to Commonwealth Court and we said, she ignored your order. And the court found her in contempt of court. They actually issued a warrant for her arrest. And when she got the warrant for her arrest, she very quickly filed the form, paid all the amounts due. And now this is the form that she had filed. We use this form to teach people what not to do and how this process works. This is what came in. I will tell you that it is not perfect. When we looked at it, we reviewed it and we determined that in all material respects, it met the requirements of the law. And we had just really kind of had enough of this situation at the time. So we accepted it for filing. And we think that this story is priceless. So don't be like her. If you mess up, fix it. If you get a letter from us about it, just fix it. There is this process to allow that to happen. We're really looking for transparency with regard to these particular forms. All right, that's all I have for you. Thank you guys for being a great audience. We are always looking to improve. This QR code will take us to a survey where you can give us feedback about how we can help you, how we did today. We want to be a resource to you. Here's our phone number you can call. I have an amazing staff. We have 5 amazing lawyers here. I have an amazing staff. We're always available to help answer your questions and talk you through issues. Please call us and use us as a resource. And that's it. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Liz Wagenseller, and she can share some wonderful information about Right to Know with you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? All right, good. All right. I'm so glad to be here and echo Mary's comments. Impressive number of people who want to hear about good government and how to be good stewards of tax dollars. And that was a very great presentation by Mary. She talked about your statement of financial interests. Mine is very blissfully boring every year, but when I fill it out and have blank after blank, I thought, well, some people have interesting things going on. I am not one of them in terms of their background. So it's always a very simple form, and if you're in state government, they made it even simpler to fill out every year. So make sure you do that by May 1st. And now I'm going to talk about another beloved topic, which is the Right to Know law. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. And sometimes the slides are flipped. So if you can see my notes, please let me know and I will flip it around. Okay, so I'm going to start my show. Do you see my notes or do you see the
We see your notes.
see my notes? Okay, let me flip it then. All right. There we go. Is that better? Okay, I'm going to start. All right. So we're going to talk about the right to know law, and I'm going to start with a story. Now, most of you, I think, are coming from the agency perspective, but this is an example of a dogged requester as well as maybe some things not to do when it comes to a right to know request. So here's the story. Back in 2016, there was an incident on a bus, public school bus. Allegedly, someone, an adult, touched another student, hit them shoved them or did something physical. And a local media station did a right to know request for the video. And for 7 years, the school district fought the release of this video. And at some point, finally, the court said, you've got to release this video. You can blur the faces of the students for privacy, but this is a public record. And whenever this happens in our office, we're always sort of primed to be, what is this record going to show? They spent all this time fighting it. It must be something really crazy. And we got the video and we watched it, and there wasn't really anything there. The alleged incident took place off camera. There wasn't much to see. And so the media station that had made the request did a little story on it, but it was really not a news story. But then a right to know request was made for the legal invoices that were charged because of the 7-year court battle to prevent the release of this nothing video. And at that point, it became a news story because this school district spent more than $250,000 fighting the release of this video. So every news station covered it. And this is to show not necessarily that an agency should not fight the release of records they think aren't public. Absolutely, they should. What it demonstrates is if things are handled in ways that seem perhaps not ideal, how you handle a right to know request could become the story, and you don't want that to become the story. So I'm going to go through a presentation talking about what this law is about, how it works, and some tips and best practices in hopes this does not become a story for your agency. So before we get into details, let's talk about why I am presenting this and what our office is. The Office of Open Records. We are an independent agency, meaning we don't answer to the governor, the legislature, the judiciary, and we issue decisions if you appeal a right to know law denial, which I will discuss, that are legally binding, meaning they must be followed if they're not appealed. And one other thing we do, one little nugget they put in the right to know law is that we provide training on the Sunshine Act, which deals with open meetings. So you may hear us associated with that. We have no authority over the Sunshine Act. We cannot review potential violations, but we do provide training. So that's what our office is. Now we will get into the law. So why do we have a right to know law? Why would anyone care about seeing invoices or emails or any type of record an agency creates? Well, there's a big reason, which is accountability. Seeing behind what the doors of government, what decisions are being made, how they're being made, who's making them, it makes you really more accountable as an agency if you know the public is going to be looking at your records, giving the access to public records. And there are a lot of stories, and some I'm going to share, where this accountability occurred. But I always think just existing it prevents some poor behavior. If they know the public can see what you're doing, you're going to behave well. Now, it probably isn't surprising that the executive director of the Office of Open Records was the captain of the safety patrols in 6th grade. It was an awesome job. We got to go to camp, lots of fun. And I remember one of the local policemen who was assigned to come talk to us talked about the fact that you are there. I was a walker. As kids walk to school, the fact that there are patrols there watching what's going on is probably preventing some kids from acting out just because they know there's someone there who's going to write one of those dreaded reports that they will have to deal with when they get to school if they misbehave. So it stops bad behavior from happening. And I think Pennsylvania having a pretty strong right to know law has that effect as well, that agencies will know that they need to consider what is right for the public and consider that they can access, how decisions are being made. So let's start with one example. As you may know, the Department of Labor and Industry in Pennsylvania, it manages the unemployment compensation system. And back in 2017, they realized they had been overcharging people. If you receive unemployment benefits and it is then discovered you actually didn't qualify, you've got to pay that money back, which is fair, and also pay a little bit of an interest penalty. And the department discovered that they had been overcharging people too high of an interest. And a reporter did a right to know request, got emails and other documents showing that they knew about this, but they didn't start paying people back. As soon as this was made in 2021, as soon as this was publicized, then they began the process of paying back people who were owed money. So there's one example. So that was a state agency. Who is subject to the right to know law? Is it every nonprofit that receives tax dollars? Is it my neighborhood association? It's a pretty comprehensive list in terms of who is subject. First, you have local agencies. Any type of municipal government, school districts, police departments, local authorities, and then any state agency, including PennDOT, Department of Education, the governor's office, what we call the row officers, auditor general, treasurer, attorney general, the state system, schools, community colleges. All of those have the most type of records that are subject to the right to know law, and which we'll be focusing on today. What about the other two branches? Not quite as broad. The General Assembly, they only have legislative records that are subject to the right to know law, which are who voted on what, transcripts of meetings, etc. And the courts have much more limited records and often involve fees. So that's a whole separate thing. So that is sort of the overview of the right to know law. Now let's get into some basics of how the law works. One of the best things about the right to know law from the requester point of view and accountability is it is a process that is meant to be simple for anyone. You do not need a law degree. You do not to know exactly what records you're trying to seek. You just need to fill out a very simple form for free, submit it to the right agency, and then hear the response and monitor what the response may be. And the most simple way the process goes is that form is submitted to the agency. We have a form on our website that every agency must use, and that request is submitted to the agency. Each agency has an open records officer who is the lucky person. I'm sure many of you on this are the open records officer. You're the lucky person who is assigned to be the point of contact for a records request. The request is reviewed, and if the request is denied, then it's appealed to our office, and we have an attorney that is assigned to review the case, and our office can either overturn that denial, saying, no, we think you should have access to the records, or uphold the denial. And if either party at that point is unhappy with the decision, it can appeal to the courts. We'll go through each of these phases a little bit more, but that's the big picture of how this works. Now, I'm going to talk about deadlines. Deadlines are a big theme of the right to know law. And the important thing to know is they are black and white. There's no, oops, I was sick, or oops, I was on vacation, or I forgot to send it. These are deadlines that are firm. And if you miss a deadline as a requester, you have to start the process over again. And in terms of the agency, the deadlines are very tight. Within 5 business days after receiving a request, an agency must do one of three following things: grant access to the records, say, yes, we're going to give you these records, deny access to records, or say, we need 30 more days, calendar days, an extension to consider the request. It can be for a multitude of reasons. Someone's on vacation, this is a more complicated request, we need more time to find these records. So there are a lot of reasons that 30-day calendar day extension is considered. Now, the appeal process is also pretty condensed. If you're a requester and you receive a denial, you are denied either all of your requests or part of it, again, you can fill out for free a very simple form that explains that you think you were unfairly denied access to the records. That has to be done within 15 business days of the mailing date, email or postal mail of the denial. You can also appeal redactions, which are considered denials, and any kind of fees that are imposed in that denial. So that goes to our office, and this is a point where the agency has a lot of involvement to do with our office. The requester, once they fill out that form and it's processed, they can sit back and do nothing if they want during this appeal process. They don't have to engage. Some do. They pose questions or point out inaccuracies, but the agency must go through a process by which they defend their decision to deny access to the records. The burden is on the agency, not the requester. And then our office has only 30 calendar days to issue our decision, which is called a final determination. So that is the process. And after that, if anyone is unhappy, either the agency or the requester, they can then appeal to the courts. It's common pleas court if it's a local agency, Commonwealth court if it's a state agency. And at that point, all those, it's free, there's tight deadlines, all of those great benefits go away, and it takes time and it requires some filing fees for the requester if they want to appeal. And typically most people appealing in the courts will hire an attorney to help with that process. The good news is in both of these, a study has shown that less than 5% of right to know requests are appealed to our office, and we get about 3,000 appeals a year. And of those 3,000 appeals, we have found that less than 5% are appealed to the courts. So the overwhelming majority don't get to our office, and those that do get to our office, the overwhelming majority are not then appealed to the courts. Now, I want to promote one option we offer in our office that it can be a really great thing to consider if your request is a little more complicated, which is mediation. Just like anything in life, sometimes talking over email doesn't produce a lot of good conversation. And mediation is a great process by which there is a private meeting over virtually where the requester, the agency, and one of our trained mediators discusses and goes through what is being requested, what can be provided, and sometimes just talking it out leads to a more fruitful process for both parties. So those are kind of process things. Let's talk about some restrictions on the right to know requests in terms of what an agency can and cannot do. First, there is no frequent flyer restriction on the right to know law. There is no saying you can only do one a year or you can only do one a week. There's nothing that restricts how often and to whom you can make these requests. And another thing is that an agency is not allowed to ask the requester, why are you making this request? What are you doing? Why are you asking about this? Why do you care? They do not have to disclose their purpose or motive. Now, an agency can try to narrow down what exactly it is they're looking for, but they can't have policies that do that. So those are some things that an agency is prohibited from doing. Here's some things that also an agency is not required to do, but can if they would like. First, they don't have to create a record that doesn't exist. I have a friend who was interested in comparing how much our school district spends on athletics versus the arts. And she did a request for those records. And the school district said, well, the best I can do is give you all of our budgets for the last several years, and you can calculate yourself. We don't have those things broken out in that way. So the agency, that was fine. They didn't have to sit there and count different records and add up to what those two numbers are. They could if they wanted to, but that is a record that doesn't exist, but they could give the requester the budgets for the past years and she could do it herself. You don't have to answer a question or conduct legal research. What gave you the right to put this stop sign here? Those are things, the right to know law is seeking records, not research or answering questions. And another thing that is becoming less common, but there are some records that only exist in hard copy. And a requester may say, could you please scan those for me? Because I don't want hard copies, or I don't want to pay the photocopying fee, which is allowed. An agency doesn't have to do that. All right, so we've been talking a lot about records. What is a record? Back in the day, it was a really simple thing. It was a file cabinet with papers. And now it is so many things, and they seem to be invented constantly. It can be an email message, a text message. It could be a TikTok video for all I know. It could be all sorts of things, a record. And one reason I wanted to include some of these specific graphics is an important thing to understand about the right to know law is that agency business being conducted, it does not matter if it is on your personal email or your professional email. If you're conducting agency business on Facebook, on personal text, those are subject to the right to know law. Imagine how people could hide from accountability. A bad actor could if they could just move all their conversations to Gmail. And so it doesn't mean that they get access to all of your Gmail or all of your Facebook messages, but it does mean that if you're conducting business on those personal, unofficial accounts, they could be considered in a request. And I always advise people, this is why it's best to just do things on official accounts and official devices. Now I'm going to talk about one story about this, and I decided to go out of state to give this example because it involves, on my bucket list, I really want to see this amphitheater. It is, I can think, the most beautiful amphitheater in America. I want to get there one day. It is Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado. And if you have been to Red Rocks in Colorado and you want to make me jealous, put in the chat who you saw there, because I'm going to get there one day. It hasn't happened yet, but I want to. It's a beautiful outdoor venue. You can Google it and see the picture. So in this case, a not so great night at Red Rocks where people were waiting to see a concert and hail came down and the people were injured, some serious injuries of very heavy hail hitting them on the head and other things. And someone got a sense that there were some text messages on employees, because it is a City of Detroit owned amphitheater, had been exchanging about the storm. So they did a request for these records, for these emails, and the agency fought this for a while. They said, well, they're on our personal accounts. It's personal message. You don't need that. And eventually a judge said, no, you need to release that. It's agency business. And they were released. And if you can see the details of it, you can see why they probably didn't want the whole world to see us. There was cracking of jokes about the next concert that occurred, about people wearing helmets and all of that. So here's a good reason to be careful about what you put in writing. Another thing I want to point out is that certain people, sometimes heads of agencies, tend to be the target highlighted in right to know requests. You know, I am the executive director of the Office of Open Records, and in 2 years, I got requests for little old me to get things such as direct Twitter message, my internet browsing history, text message, my resume, pictures, cell phone bill, all sorts of things. Now, not all of these are public. Some of these are not necessarily public under the right to know law, but just an example of the type of records that someone could request. So what is public? Well, there's a couple things I want to mention that tend to be public. One, financial records. Financial records, how taxpayer dollars are being spent. Financial records are the bread and butter of the right to know law. The law was written such that the bar is very high for financial records to be not disclosed. And the idea being the public has a right to see this. We recently had a case where a national, very well-known company had done a contract with a municipality, and they wanted to withhold the contract because they said, well, we put some trade secrets in there. We don't want our competitors to see that. And the decision was, well, maybe you shouldn't put them in there because the public has a right to see that record. Another thing is aggregated data tends to be public because it is not identifiable to an individual. Those are a couple of broad categories. There's lots of things, but of course you're not getting everything. You don't want to, there's certain records that should not be released. And some of those are prohibited in other laws. You remember all hearing about HIPAA during COVID. There's health records that can't be released. There's a federal law that involves student records called FERPA. Those cannot be released. So those are outside the right to know law. Within the right to know law, there are exemptions, and these are things you're not prohibited from releasing, but do not have to. One is personal identification information. You're not getting anybody's social security, personal cell phone, other types of information. Another one is insufficiently specific requests. I know this one can aggravate agencies because it is not something where we can put this in a magic formula and say that's specific and that's not. ChatGPT is not going to solve whether or not, so you can predetermine if something is specific enough. But the general idea is that you can't go on a wild goose chase. If someone said, I want every email Liz Wagenseller ever sent as executive director the past 4 years. Well, that's just not specific enough. If they said, I'd like every email that was sent about the specific presentation, perhaps that is specific enough. Another type of record that you don't have to release, internal pre-decisional deliberation. The idea, I think, behind this exemption is that government employees are allowed to share drafts, play devil's advocate, make question about how they're going to go in one way or another, and not have the spotlight on that. Not worry about in terms of if this first draft that I made that is terrible will be released. But all of those words must apply. It must be internal. It must be between government employees. It must be before the decision is being made. So the final draft would be public, but perhaps not the other drafts, the final version, but not the drafts. And also has to be deliberation going on. If there's just an exchange of facts, perhaps those would not be able to subject to this exemption. Attorney-client privilege, I think we know what that is. A record does not exist. Some people think, well, you should have that invoice or you should have those meeting minutes. The right to know law does not opine on whether or not a record should exist. It just deals with the existence of a record. And then another one that surprises people is records that do not reflect agency business. If someone in my office just said, my daughter is selling Girl Scout cookies, I'm going to leave the form in the break room, please fill it out. They send that email around. And someone did a right to know request for those emails about the Girl Scout cookies, we wouldn't have to provide it because the Thin Mint tally is not what the Office of Open Records is about. It is not about that business, so we wouldn't have to provide it. Now I'm going to share an example of an infamous case involving something that was not considered an agency record. Who remembers, gosh, it was a while ago now, former Attorney General Kathleen Kane. 10 years, it looks like, over 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. She came in as Attorney General and she discovered that employees were exchanging lewd emails on Office of Attorney General email accounts. And she came out and talked about it. This is not appropriate. And the media did a right to know request for those emails. And it went to the Commonwealth Court eventually. And the Commonwealth Court said, as terrible as these emails are, this is not just because they were sent or received on Attorney General email doesn't make it subject to the right to know law. This is not about what the business that they do, these pornographic emails. And so they did not have to release those emails. And then another one of my favorite, most creative requests we have ever gotten is, as you know, high school football is a big deal in Pennsylvania. And someone got the genius idea to do a right to know request for the rival team's football playbook. Sadly, or maybe happily, the sacredity of the football playbook was upheld, and we found that the record here, the football playbook, does not directly relate to the performance of the district's function. So that was protected and the playbook was kept secret and it was not provided. Okay, one more thing before we move on to a couple other tips and best practices. What if a record has a few sections that are exempt? You're saying, oh, there's some things here that we don't have to provide, but we could. But other things that are public. Well, you don't get to just withhold the entire record because portions of it are not subject. There's redactions, and those redactions can be done electronically, or they can be done if you prove that you don't have the type of technology to safely redact things. You can print it out and black out with a Sharpie. A couple of notes on that. You cannot charge labor fees for redactions. And if you do have to print it out, you can charge photocopying fees for doing that. All right, so that is a bit of background. And if you're new to this or you've learned a lot of things, there's a lot of information, things that may be concerning, intimidating. And I'm going to go through some tips and best practices of things to consider for your agency going forward. Before I start, I want to make it clear the caveat that I cannot give legal advice, nor can anyone in my office, but these are just some suggestions of things to consider. The most important thing I think to say is the easiest, but one of the easiest to also perhaps make an error is not to make unforced errors. Making sure how your agency is set up to process right to know requests is a tight ship. Those of you open records officers, making sure that they are trained. And we have plenty of trainings on our website, and we offer them on a fairly regular basis virtually. Make sure they're trained, and make sure you have someone who's a backup, because someone could get sick, someone could leave, and making sure you have a backup. Second, I always recommend that you always respond to a request, always. And the reason is that you may lose some of your ability to deny access to records later on if you do not participate. We had a case where a police department ignored a request for a type of policy that the police department had, and the requester then appealed to our office because it was considered a deemed denial. They did not respond, so they appealed to our office. We reached out to the police department. Police department did not respond. And the right to know law, like I've mentioned, the burden is on the agency to prove why they think these records should be withheld. Since we got radio silence, we granted access to the records because we didn't hear any defense from the agency. We are not going to defend things on the agency's behalf. And then that was ignored. And then the requester took them to court because they were ignoring our order. And I'm not sure the outcome at this point, but eventually the police chief went on the stand and said, "I'm so sorry. We had someone who was the open records officer who just wasn't paying attention, wasn't doing their job, and they're no longer with us." And again, I don't know the outcome, but at least initially the judge said that that's not an excuse. This law's been around for a long time. Incompetence by someone on your staff is not a reason to ignore this. And this police department may lose the ability to legally withhold this record that they think is too sensitive to be publicly released. So always respond to a request. Another one is follow record retention rules. And agencies have different types of rules depending on if they're a township of the second class or a state agency. And this is twofold record retention. First of all, not following record retention rules could be a not very good headline for someone if you are deleting records that should be maintained for a certain number of years. And two, you also want to consider the time it might take if you have a bunch of records that you probably could have gotten rid of. If someone said, "I want every email that Liz Weigenseller sent to a certain person," and I had a lot of emails going back and forth about what time should we meet for lunch or what time should the meeting be, and blah 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 blah, because I have those records might then have to be released, and it takes a lot of time. So follow record retention rules, making sure you're keeping records you should keep. And now I want to talk about something that you're going to say, "Liz, I don't want to do this," but it can be really helpful. Just like I mentioned in mediation, sometimes picking up the phone and talking to people can make such a difference. Talking over email, talking over records is something that things can get lost in translation. And I met a township supervisor once who had a woman who requested quite a lot of budget records. And it would have taken his staff many, many hours to fulfill. It would have cost her some money for photocopying fees. And he said, "I'm just going to call her." So he called her up. They had a great chat. And it turns out all that she wanted was how much they spent on snow plowing each of the past 3 years. 3 numbers. That's all she wanted. And so they were able to fulfill that request easy for her. It saved everyone time and money. So sometimes if you think it won't be an adversarial conversation, picking up the phone can help. As I mentioned, you cannot ask why they want the records, but also put everything in writing. If you talk to someone and say, "I talked to her," put an email. I would actually email the requester and say, "It was nice to talk to you. Per our conversation on March 17th, I am giving you these records as in response to your request, modified request." So making sure it's in writing. Now, one thing about the right to know law that I haven't mentioned is that the identity of the requester cannot be considered. It's not something typically that you can say, "Well, this person shouldn't get this record because of something they said before." But one story that is infamous in our office is one where the identity of the requester mattered. In this case, a woman had a pet kangaroo, and for reasons I'm unsure of, the pet kangaroo was taken away from her. And she then attempted to break into the facility where her pet kangaroo was being kept, and they moved the kangaroo to a secret location. She then did a right to know request to the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and it was denied, and our decision upheld the decision to deny the records because she had proven that she was a threat to the physical safety of the building and perhaps of the employees there. So she was denied access, and the kangaroo remains in the witness protection program, as far as I know, to this day. And there was recently a Pennsylvania headline where the Game Commission took away a woman's pet deer. So we are waiting with bated breath to see if we get a request related to that situation. Another tip I like to share is that the reminder that the right to know law is a not a confidentiality statute. There are 30 exemptions, but remember, like I said, these are not saying you shall not. It's saying you don't have to release those records. You can give out public records if you'd like to. And the other thing is to put things on your website. This is such a great thing to do. It's one of my most favorite pieces of advice, because if you put things like budgets and contracts and policies, one, it makes it easy if you have a request, or you may not even get requests and say, here's the link to the request. We already have it on our website. Two, it shows you have nothing to hide and that you're putting it out there for people to see. So please come look at this. So it's a great thing to consider. Another thing to consider is, like I said, it's not a confidentiality law, and you can consider releasing records that you don't have to, that are perhaps could be exempt under the right to know law, but are not. One example I give is my resume. I was appointed to this position by former Governor Wolf in 2021. So someone requested my resume, and because we did not have it, it was not a record in the agency, it wasn't in our system, in our email, we didn't have to provide it. We could deny and say, it's not, we don't have that record. But we thought about it. We said, okay, I'm the executive director of the Office of Open Records. I think seeing my resume is something that the public should be able to see. So I took a version and I took out some personal contact information, but we went ahead and graded this to the requesters. Sometimes the public interest will outweigh any interest in withholding it. It's just something to consider. You don't want to release things you shouldn't release, but it makes everyone's life easier sometimes just to give a record that there's no downside to releasing that. Another thing I want to really highlight is the search process. This is a really, really important thing when you're an agency, is making sure that you have a thorough search process. It's called a good faith search. The agency has to demonstrate they have done that. And the best way it should work is that you inform the open records officer, receives the request, and then the open records officer says, okay, here's who I think might have these records, and send an email saying, hey, do you have any of these records? Please look. And this includes contractors, people who are not employees, but may have the records. And then obtain all the potentially responsive records and determine if they're public. So we get requests. We get almost 1,000 requests a year just to our office. And our open records officer, even though I am the executive director of the Office of Open Records, and I know a lot about this law, if I get an email saying that these records are being requested, I will give our open records officer everything under the sun and let them determine whether or not they're public, rather than me making that decision myself. And when an agency comes before us, my office, and says, we don't have that record, it's not good enough to say, yeah, we looked, we didn't have it. Sorry. Think about it from the point of view, if someone has been arrested for robbing a bank and they say they're innocent, they don't just go up on the stand and say, yeah, I didn't rob that bank, and step down. When you defend as an agency that you did a good faith search, it's important to describe that you looked in all the potential places it might be. And there are examples on if you look at we have every decision we've ever made on our website. You can search for those and see what it is that find someone who has proven in a good faith search and consider that. And the consequences, if you do not do a good faith search, can be severe. Here's a couple of cases of bad faith behavior where the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority did not provide evidence regarding a good faith search for requested records, and Penn Ridge School District also altered records and failed to produce records. And in both these cases, there were penalties assigned for doing this. So it's important that you do a good faith search. I don't want it to be intimidating. You don't have to hire a cyber forensic person to search everything. You just have to demonstrate that you made a good faith effort to look in the places that this record might be. But it's important to do that, to take those requests seriously, and then be prepared to defend that decision going forward. All right, so Good news for you all, I'm going to wrap up a little early, give you an extra time to maybe take an early lunch and leave you with this. As I said, we cannot give you legal advice, but we have a fantastic website chock full of information. Every decision we've made that you can search by agency or requester or by certain words. We have a guide for citizens, a guide for agencies. We have a guidebook for a court office of open records office of open records, open records officers. We have a phone number. We have real live amazing people who answer the phone. There's no press one to talk to somebody about this. Call us, email us, ask us questions. We can try to point you in the right direction. We have so much training available. If you have an event where you think it'd be helpful for us to virtually or in person come to train, we can talk about whether that's something we're able to do. Please consider us a resource. And going forward, you can reach out if you have questions. So I'm going to stop. I could not see the chat. So if there were any questions to me, I'm going to end the slideshow and check in with my team to see if there's things that we need to address. How do we get the recording? We're going to post it on a blog post. Is that right, Janelle? And we will have the PowerPoint and the video from my office. But it'll be available. We'll have a little alert on our homepage saying here's where to find it. Okay, I am gonna not seeing anything that I think I need to address. I will exit. Thank you all for joining us. So many of you, and there are 280 people still here at the end. How awesome. Thanks for being interested in good government. Thank you, Mary Fox, for this great idea. And we look forward to seeing you all out in the world or on another training at some point. Take care, everybody.